our group, we are women with sometimes 30, 40 years of experience working on different fields, but with a common denominator of gender equality and women's rights. Basically, our idea, our purpose, our motto is intergenerational dialogue. So we come to you to hear your voice, to listen to your ideas for action. If you were the pen holder of the transformative action on the 6 action coalitions, what would you write? Younger generations, we are convinced, I'm a witness of that, can push movements forward. We need your help, your agency, your intelligence in making gender equality a strong, powerful, and substantial movement from which women and girls and society at large can benefit.
Hi, and welcome. My name is Angela Kane, and I'm a member of the Group of Women Leaders, which means that many of us who are in this group have been at the United Nations, and obviously our experience is very different from the one that you're going to be facing as becoming leaders in your world, because we had to fight an awfully hard. But we have a wonderful panel here of young people who are aspiring to be leaders, and I hope will become leaders. And I will introduce them in a moment. But before I do, let me just add that there is an app that you can download, because one of the participants will be speaking in Spanish. So if you wish to have interpretation, you can go to the app, you can download it, follow the instructions in the chat, and you will be fully able to hear the person. Now, what is the Generation Equality Forum? I think you know that it's a really global gathering that started in Mexico City at the end of March, and it had really a wonderful participation. I think there were more than 13,000 participants from all parts of the world. And nearly half of them, I think was 48%, were 34 years and younger. So that was a great success that we had. And it started in Mexico. Now we are on the road to Paris, which is the second part of it, which goes from tomorrow actually until the 2nd of July. And this will be headed at attended by a very high level gathering. And so here we are preparing. It's called On the Road to Paris. So we're not on the road, we're on the computer to Paris, but in any case, we're anticipating Paris. So that's really very good. And we're going to look at not only what can we do, we'd like to set goals. And what I also would like to remind you is that it's not only important to set goals, but it's also important to have a mechanism to follow the implementation. You know, if we get back a year from now, what has happened? Has it actually been implemented? What has been achieved? And then if it hasn't been achieved, why didn't it get achieved, or why didn't we make it? And so what can be done to actually advance it? I think that, to my mind, is really the most important part of it. But I don't want to go on. I just want to also introduce you to the 4 young panelists that we are having. And I'd like to say that we have, I'm going to start with Jennifer Rodriguez, who is the one que va a hablar en español. Yeah, okay, thank you, Jennifer. She's in her last, she's a student, and she's in her last year of a legal studies at the University Dr. José Matías Delgado, and she's also been participating in various activities relating to gender. And then we have, and I'm following here my screen, we have Linda Nilima, and she is a gender and peace building professional, and she is actually at the University of Peace in Costa Rica. Next is Jennifer Grossman. She is a gender and climate specialist, and she's in the United States at Georgetown University. And lastly, we have Ashley Anderson. She's a US Navy veteran and a Boston University MFA candidate, and she's particularly interested in the issue of women in the military. So this is a very interesting selection of participants, and I really look forward to speaking to you. And I would like to start right away and basically sort of say we have a number of questions, and we have several rounds that we're going to be doing it. And the Generation Equality Forum has developed certain themes for this topic. And so I'm actually going to ask you to have a response to the first one. And this is basically, and I should just like to see, and is the list of themes that were identified are actually several of them. And I wondered, rather than listing them now, I just wanted to ask you if you have any one of them that is particularly important, that particularly rings a bell. It's 6 themes, so is there a particular one that you feel is very important to you? And maybe you can also speak a little bit about why is it important to you. Maybe I'll start on the other side now on my screen. Maybe Ashley, can I ask you to take the floor, please?
Absolutely. Thank you, Angela. So I'm particularly interested in gender-based violence, particularly in the United States military. I worked at Wellesley College as a class of 1967 intern at the Wellesley Centers for Women, specifically at the Justice and Gender-Based Violence Initiative. And my research focused on the inclusion of voices of self-identified victims of sexual assault in the military. Unfortunately, we were not able to get a lot of participants because it's very difficult to, one, reach out to military populations, and two, a lot of people just don't report for many reasons. Women in the military are particularly vulnerable to sexual assaults. According to my research, 1 in 4 women report experiencing sexual assault in the military, as opposed to 1% of men. And of course, this is only representative of those who choose to report. Only 1 in 4 women file a report according to studies. And yeah, I just think like women make up 1/6 of the US military, yet the majority of sexual assault cases. And I think that we need to be asking why. I've also found that research shows that rates of sexual harassment and assault are higher in masculine job gender contexts like the military. So I think that there is a lot to unpack and explore there. And this is something that has been in the media in the last couple of years, particularly with documentaries like The Invisible War. And so, yeah, as a veteran, gender-based violence is a topic that hits really close to home.
I think that absolutely resonates with me as well. And I was dispatched by Secretary General Kofi Annan at the time when the first reports came out from the Democratic Republic of the Congo about sexual exploitation and abuse. I mean, it's sexual violence, yes, I mean, that's part of it. And I did a big study of it. And that was quite scary as to what one saw, and quite horrifying as to how little was done. And that was, of course, not only involving the military at the time, but also the civilian employees of the United Nations. But it's an issue that in the time since I was there has not gone away, and it's not gotten appreciably better either. So it's clearly an area that really needs to be pointed to sort of say, what are we going to do about it? But thank you for bringing that up. A very good topic. Now, Jennifer Grossman, I have to use the last name since we have 2 Jennifers here. So can I turn over to you?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here today and learn from each other. For me personally, I think the Action Coalition around a feminist action for climate justice is incredibly important, because we know that women are disproportionately impacted by climate change because of pre-existing vulnerabilities and discrimination they face. So women and girls are less able to absorb climate shocks. However, this Action Coalition also recognizes that women are leaders in building climate resilient communities. They're not just vulnerable groups, but empowered women can, offer these solutions that the world needs as we face the coming climate crisis. And I think this, the fact that the forum is including climate as a theme is really crucial, since climate policy intersects with other of these generational equality action coalition themes, such as gender-based violence, like Ashley just mentioned, because we know that climate exacerbates conflict, and then gender-based violence emerges, economic justice as countries and communities are deciding now how to transition to a low carbon economy, but also themes like the Technology and Innovation Coalition, since climate adaptation strategies aren't always designed with the needs and perspectives of women and girls included. I do think it's really important when we have these conversations today and throughout the week, that we need to remember that gender inequalities are compounded by racial injustice. And we see that climate impacts are even more pronounced for Indigenous women and women from communities of color and low-income communities, and really bear that in mind as we design policies as the Action Coalition goes forward. But I do want to end just saying that I'm very excited to see that we have this, focus on climate justice, because, globally we're in a really unique opportunity right now. World leaders are working to recover from COVID with massive public investments, and many of those are targeted towards climate action. We also have policymakers going to be meeting in Glasgow this November for the UN Climate Summit, COP26. So here's an opportunity for grassroots organizers, civil society, private sector, and policymakers to come together to really leverage this time, this window to advance gender equality through robust and just climate action. So I'm looking forward to seeing what the coalition is going to do and the progress that's going to be made and how we're going to learn from each other.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Very important. And I think that we are now at the highest point that I've ever seen in terms of awareness of where climate is leading us. And as you said, there's a lot of interaction with other and involucration with other topics that actually mesh into this. I just saw this morning on Twitter there was a UN report published, and the UN doesn't always write very well in terms of the language. And this actually, and I haven't read it yet, but it basically said this was the best report because it basically was very stark in the language, and it was very stark in the warnings that came out of it. So maybe that's also something that one can look at as days go on, and particularly in preparation, as you said, of the Glasgow meeting. Very important topic, absolutely. Jennifer, entonces, ¿qué piensas tú de los temas que nosotros tenemos para discutir? And please, let me just say again, there is an app that you can download. Please check again in your chat box if you wish to have the interpretation from Spanish. Jennifer.
Muchísimas gracias, Angela. Quisiera comentarles que la lista de los temas que vemos como visto en el foro, todos son muy atractivos y todos son interesantes y muy importantes de abordar. Sin embargo, particularmente, yo considero que hay dos temas principales que en lo particular a mí me hacen ruido, que me interesan mucho más que los demás, y es la justicia y los derechos económicos respecto a las mujeres. ¿Y por qué la justicia y los derechos económicos? Y es que nosotras las mujeres siempre hemos ido como a la vanguardia de diversas luchas por los derechos de las minorías, por la justicia y también intentando generar cambios de incidencia en la sociedad. Al menos quisiera comentarles que en lo personal creo que nosotros luchamos por un sistema que no criminalice o revictimice a las mujeres y buscamos la igualdad siempre y la justicia, un trato igualitario pues. Y es que una de las mayores desigualdades que encontramos es en el área económica o laboral en respecto a las mujeres. Y es que laboralmente nosotras realmente hacemos las mismas cosas, las mismas actividades, a veces mucho más actividades o trabajo que los hombres, y no somos remuneradas igualmente que ellos. De hecho, nuestro trabajo se ve invisibilizado, cuestionado o en cierto punto juzgado porque no tenemos las capacidades y habilidades que un hombre tiene. Y esto realmente complica el hecho de tener una igualdad respecto a los derechos económicos de la mujer, porque realmente a veces y generalmente la realidad en nivel centroamericano es que por culturas machistas, patriarcales, sexistas, por el simple hecho de ser mujer, a nosotros se nos discrimina y literalmente no tenemos una remuneración igualitaria. En ese sentido, cabe mencionar que post la pandemia y durante la pandemia de COVID, hubo una investigación de muchas organizaciones y movimientos feministas en el país, a las cuales yo pude participar y estar presente. Ahí se manifestaban como algunas y se evidenciaban algunas situaciones de desigualdad que tenían las mujeres, porque por la pandemia de COVID, las mujeres tenían que encargarse de la casa, de las labores de cuidado, debían de ver el tema de la educación de sus hijos, debían preparar la comida y aún así trabajar desde su casa. Y solamente en tema de COVID literalmente generaba un estrés, generaba una tensión e incertidumbre de no saber si realmente estas mujeres iban a tener su trabajo y si iban a seguir siendo en muchos casos proveedoras de sus hogares. Entonces realmente vemos que la pandemia y otras situaciones han afectado en su mayoría al sector de la mujer, porque por datos también se reflejaban que los hombres mantenían su mismo estatus, sus ingresos no fueron afectados de la manera en la que las mujeres lo pudieron percibir. Y es que una frase muy común que queda literalmente solo en papel es que a igual trabajo, igual remuneración. Pero esta frase no se cumple. Esto es una realidad muy alejada a lo que nosotros presentamos actualmente. Y respecto al tema de los liderazgos y movimientos feministas, a mí en lo personal me llama la atención porque hemos tenido una serie de mujeres y hemos visto a través de la historia mujeres que han incidido, han literalmente enfrentado al sistema patriarcal, como el caso de la señora Prudencia Ayala. Ella era una salvadoreña que existió hace muchos años en El Salvador y que ella, pese a toda la cultura machista, sexista, misógina que había en esos tiempos, ella se propuso como candidata a la presidencia y pudo mostrar que ella podía también, que no solo era un hombre el que podía liderar una república o un cargo tan importante como lo es una presidencia de un país. Entonces, es por eso que esto motiva e inspira a que nosotros nos podamos organizar y podamos liderar movimientos feministas. Que quiero aclarar que el feminismo no es que la mujer se va a poner en una posición más alta que el hombre, sino que va a buscar la igualdad por el simple hecho de que son personas y tienen las mismas habilidades, capacidades y virtudes.
Muchas gracias, Jennifer. I think we all know, we're all aware of the conundrum when you have not same job, same pay, which simply is an aspiration. It's not a reality in many cases. And I think it is also very true. Many countries have problems in terms of the situation of the woman. And in this country where I am now, right now, in Austria, when you think about all of the caregivers, particularly during the COVID time, when you think about all the people who take care also of the elderly, they're very poorly paid very often. They don't get the recognition. And I think that most of the caring, not only for sick people, but also when it comes to the family, children who are homeschooled, etc., there's a great discrepancy with what you say, the culture of the machismo, etc. So there's a great discrepancy as to what people are doing. So I very much appreciate you bringing that up. Now we're coming to Linda. It's over to you. What do you think is your most important subject that you're picking out of the topics?
Thank you, Angela. I would like to talk about gender-based violence during the pandemic. And also, as we all know, we all know that at the moment we are doing the vaccination. So gender-based violence was seen as a shadow pandemic by the UN. And I can say that it's unlikely to know the exact number of these cases because most of them during the lockdowns went unreported. And because it also happens in an enclosed environment, especially in the homes. And perpetrators are known to the victims. They can be intimate partners, extended family members, neighbors. So the pandemic only showed the structural inequalities that affect women and girls. And I can say that the quarantine paradox provided a solid opportunity for gender-based violence to thrive because people lost their jobs. There was economic vulnerabilities, psychological and mental health issues. These issues come from isolations, loneliness, and uncertainty. So this all intersect and made gender-based violence to thrive. Currently, as we all understand, that there is gender inequality in access to COVAX, especially in the countries of the global south. And in these countries, women make more than a third of the people working in social profession. They're also at the high risk of infections. And we all understand that they keep our systems running as doctors, nurses, as you said, Angela, caregivers, and even the cashiers in the supermarkets. So some of the barriers that are making it hard to access vaccines are the gender norms, decision making in seeking healthcare services. We have also domestic care obligations. Women have time poverty, balancing between family, work, and all that. And then we also have physical access and intersecting vulnerabilities we find that issues of mobility, especially in key population groups like displaced people, asylum seekers, migrant workers, people fleeing from humanitarian crises, majority of which are women. They have difficulty in registering due to lack of national identity cards. They are on the move all the time. So they also have issues of security accessing the immunization centers. Some are fear being arrested because like most countries close their borders for immigrants. And also they have difficulty keeping immunization appointments. And also the work and the domestic care obligations is another challenge. And in some countries in Africa where we have prolonged conflicts and civil unrest, we have challenges for supply of the vaccine. And also we have such a shortage of healthcare workers. Another thing that is a challenge is limited information to specific groups, like people living with disability, people living with HIV/AIDS, even lactating mothers and pregnant women. They don't know really how the vaccines might affect because they are now a specific population group. They have different needs, and because of their way. And then the last thing I can say is also education, literacy, and digital gender gap. This means that women are less likely to receive relevant and trustworthy information about the vaccines. So what can I say? What can we do to improve this situation? The first thing is recognizing how critical women participation in all areas of our life, from pandemic response plans and formulation of policies that ensure equality in accessing these essential services, also social protection and addressing issues of gender-based violence. And the last one is that we have to understand the intersectionality of health, economy, and social issues, because the pandemic really showed there is a discrepancy in that sector, the three sectors, and which are crucial for any response plan. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you very much, Linda. Very expansive what you were talking about in terms of also the various women who are disadvantaged, and also like even, as you said, the cash register workers. I mean, there's so many of them that are in low-paying jobs, and that's jobs that men would not necessarily take, and yet they're very much exposed. And the issue of COVAX and the vaccinations is, of course, a very pertinent one to sort of see where we're going progress. Now, you've already brought out a little bit about, what could be done, and that's actually my next question. And, let's think about how long this has been. I mean, remember we had the first Mexico City conference, and then we had the Beijing conference. I mean, we've been at this for a long time. And as I mentioned before, what is really important is to sort of see how we can make progress. I will never forget, I think it was Hillary Clinton when she said at the Beijing conference, women's rights are human rights. And I really liked that. I mean, it's very encompassing as to, what can really be done. But, there are many countries, there are many organizations, there are very companies even, they're making commitments. And I've seen that myself when member states made commitments in the United Nations, only never to implement them, or rather to implement them in such a slow manner that it would take decades to even get anywhere. So the question is, yes, there are commitments made, but progress is very slow. I mean, have you seen that happen? And, have you any advice as to what could be done to maybe advance that somewhat? Maybe, Ashley, I can start with you again, please.
Of course. So I think the biggest thing for me is media coverage. So as far as tackling sexual assault in the military goes, there really wasn't a lot of action on a federal level, or like a level outside of the military, which is a very self-contained entity, until a series of scandals prompted Congress to initiate a task force to fight this issue. And it wasn't until then that non-penetrative acts were looped into the definition of sexual assault. It wasn't until then that there was more legislation on sexual harassment. And so the only thing that really got this ball rolling was public outrage. And I think we just all need to be paying attention. As exhausting as it is, the more that we pay attention and talk about this and encourage our legislators to do something about it, the more that's going to happen. So I think media coverage for me is a big one.
That's a very important point, but what I worry about sometimes is where the coverage can also get distorted, because there's so much social media out there, there's so much misinformation or fake information, if I call it that is out there, that I think one has to be very careful as to what media you actually encourage to publish. I want to remind you of something that I thought at the time was absolutely amazing. Do you know when rape was first considered a war crime?
I don't actually.
It was in 1993, and that was in the wars in former Yugoslavia. And, at the time, it was very much opposed, but there were a number of member states actually that fought very hard to have it recognized as a war crime. And since then, it's been accepted, in the legal jurisprudence to sort of say, yes, rape is a war crime. But that was actually the first time, and that's basically 30 years ago. It's not even that long ago, but it seems like a lifetime to some of us. But I think that was a very important event at the time when it occurred, particularly for the women who were raped in great numbers. At the time, it was very much a validation of the things that they had suffered. And now it's become very much an accusing for actually going after whole groups of people, whole groups of countries that would condone this. So I think it's very important. But now let me go to who would be the next? Jennifer Grossman.
Yes, I think financing is crucial to actually see this progress being made. As you mentioned, we've had decades of really admirable work that's really progressed gender equality worldwide. But without financial resources that's dedicated towards gender targets or budgeting that's gender sensitive, so taking into account the impacts of these government programs, on gender, on different groups, these commitments are hard won and they're necessary to achieve progress, but without that financial backing, they're just promises in many ways. Even in well-meaning organizations, after leadership has made a commitment to gender equality, after putting emissions in place and targets, if funding isn't attached, the gender work can be sidelined. I've seen that happen both in civil society, academia, and governments, that if we don't have these dedicated resources laid out ahead of time, the gender work can be pushed aside, especially in civil society, as we know, with organizations trying to do various work under limited resources. You really need to have that financial commitment. And bring it briefly back to climate, the Feminist Action for Climate Coalition is calling for an increase in the proportion of climate financing that targets gender. And that's really crucial to lock in these allocated gender funds and gender sensitivity for all climate adaptation mitigation projects right now, because the world leaders are currently developing these long-term climate strategies that are going to guide our international development for many years in the future. So we really want to make sure that we have gender sensitivity built in right at this stage to make those projects both more effective for climate adaptation down the line, but also really work towards gender equality as well.
Very, very good point, in fact, and I hope that that's going to be actually happening, that the funding and the financing for that is increased, because that's absolutely crucial. Because most of that work, I think that there are some countries that are pushing very hard also for that, particularly the Nordic countries, or Ireland or New Zealand. Those are very much forerunners in terms of this and willing to fund it. Even my own country, Germany, has done some of it, but it's not enough. It needs to be actually systematized or actually built structurally into the whole effort. So I think that's a very good point. Let me turn to Jennifer. Jennifer, ¿qué piensas tú?
Yo considero y he visto que muchas empresas y organizaciones y ciudades sí se comprometen con implementar mecanismos que tengan que ver con la igualdad de género, pero esto tiene muy poca aplicabilidad. Pese a que en El Salvador y en la región centroamericana hemos visto que se han creado diferentes decretos, leyes, reglamentos que regulan la igualdad del género, pero realmente no nos tomamos la tarea de informar de incidir y sensibilizar a las personas sobre lo que es la igualdad de género y sus implicaciones. Entonces realmente no sirve, no es viable crear leyes si realmente la gente no va a tener conocimiento de lo que tiene o lo que necesita realizar para que exista una igualdad real del género. Generalmente, y es que es un problema de cultura realmente. La región centroamericana generalmente dice, no, es que estas niñas que andan buscando, o estas mujeres que andan buscando la implementación de decretos o leyes que van encaminadas al género, son aquellas resentidas o aquellas personas que tienen algún recelo con algún hombre. Y realmente no, realmente confunden los términos. Y eso le ocasiona una mala información y el desconocimiento de la población en general. Entonces, realmente yo creo que el proceso en muchos casos ha retrocedido. No digo que sí hay sectores muy reducidos que intentan y han implementado desde sus espacios este tipo de leyes o acciones que van encaminadas al respeto del hombre y la mujer y de otras de organizaciones que van en la igualdad y la justicia, porque realmente el feminismo busca tener esa igualdad de derechos entre un hombre y una mujer. Entonces va más allá de que sola sea mujer o porque por algún mal sentimiento, sino que es más encaminado al tema de que es un respeto y es un derecho que como persona debería de tener.
I think that's a very important point as well, because laws are really the foundation for the ability to implement what's going to happen. But unfortunately, the laws are on paper, they need to be enforced. And the enforcement very often takes place at the private level, whether it's companies, as you said, empresas, whatever. And there it is not always implemented in terms of as it should be according to the law. And I think that's one thing that really has to be watched over. And that even happens in countries here in Europe, where you have certain stipulations that are being made. Like, for example, women have to be board members 30%. And that's basically was enacted already several years ago, and it's still not being enforced simply because there's a lot of opposition to it. That's just an example, from in the world that I live. But it's very, very important, absolutely. But laws are the foundation which needed to start with. Linda, over to you.
Thank you, Angela. I can say that having worked in many organizations in my country, I've come across this issue where we have good laws, good policies, but implementation is a problem. And also research shows that people in many organizations acknowledge that gender-based exists in general, but most of them, they fail to see it from their daily workplace interactions. And then issues of gender mainstreaming mostly are perceived as simply adding women, getting a gender balance, and also having a tick in the box like, yeah, we have women, but the actual agency of women, what are women adding in the organization, who is making decisions, who is in power, all that issues, issues of career development and all that issues of who is earning what is not addressed. So you just want to have women, we add women, but we cannot feel the women, the change, what change are they making in such organizations. Another thing Angela can say is that we have gender fatigue in most organizations that I've seen. And it occurs when people are tired of hearing about gender equality or even issues of diversity. So most people are no longer motivated to make change in their organizations. Examples of this I can say that I have seen. Many people assume that it happens elsewhere, maybe at other organizations, but not in your own organization. They also believe that gender inequality existed in the past. We have been talking about it for a long time. So something that is no longer an issue. And to add on that, they also say that there have been many initiatives to support women as evidence now that gender equality has been addressed because of those initiatives. And when they see incidents of discrimination, the reason that the situation had nothing to do with gender is just discrimination. So the gender lens is not applied. And also, Angela, I can say that in most of the organizations that I've seen, gender issues are treated as a social issue, not seen as an economic or even a political issue. So, economic, political is really a key in addressing gender issue, because like politics, we have to come up with good policies, legislations, and all that. And also I can say that like in my country now, the context of women in leadership, there is a nexus between policy, that is the constitution, and what has been implemented. Like in 2010, we passed the constitution, and it has been lauded as one of the most progressive constitutions in the world, because it has a gender component of the to that gender role, that is the affirmative action clause, in all elective, appointive, and nominated positions. But I'm sad to report that we have done so far 2 elections under that constitution. And in both elections of 2013 and 2017, we did not meet the 30% constitutional requirement. So what is the problem? Because now the supreme law of the land has been mutilated. We can say that because of political parties, politics, which is the greatest stepping stone and gatekeeper to women interest to leadership, most of them are owned and controlled by men. So it's very rare to find men nominating or even supporting women during nominations, or supporting women aspirants. And also I can say maybe political will by the government of the day also plays a role in achieving the constitutional requirement. And then the greatest gap that the constitution did not address is the issues of the timeline of achieving the 2/3 gender rule, because it's just an open document. So like the judicial redress said that rule that because it's a provision, maybe it's a progressive, it doesn't give the timeline that we should have achieved this constitutional provision. So that one is something that when we make laws, we need to have a time frame or a timeline of achieving such clauses. And then in conclusion, I can say maybe what can we do or what can we learn from this? The first thing is we stop denying the existence of gender inequality in our organization so that we can make progress. And also in areas of politics and women leadership, we have to do party reforms to reflect the level of commitment to gender goals. And women, we have to do a lot of networking. And also in addition, we have gender, age, and disaggregated data. We should now translate it to programming at all levels. Thank you.
Thank you. That was quite comprehensive, what you were offering, not only one issue. And you mentioned gender fatigue, which I hadn't heard about, but I think I'm going to push that aside, because one can never, as a woman, one can never have gender fatigue. I think gender fatigue is only on the part of men. So, that's one of the issues. What I found really interesting is that you mentioned also that it is, the quote, the gender issue is very often considered a social issue. And I agree with you. And I want to remind you that in the UN, we had this resolution 1325, which I'm sure you're aware of, on women, peace, and security. And it had very defined objectives. But the only objective that was initially focused on was actually the women as victims. And that was really something that I, at the time, very much resented, because I thought this is not the only aim. One of the issues is, yes, I mean, there's a protection element there, but on the other hand, the other one was also the women as doer, as being a leading in political affairs and negotiations, etc. So there was a lot more in it. And that has taken a long time. I mean, that resolution was passed in 2000, so that's taken a long time to actually come to fruition. But one of the aspects I wanted to draw your attention to, and that comes also, Linda, to this very good point you mentioned about the social issue, is there was a recent resolution that was adopted about women in peacekeeping. And of course, they always want to increase the number of women peacekeepers, which is a very good effort. But it was the only resolution that focused on, and believe it or not, it was under the chairmanship, I think, of Indonesia at the time that it was adopted. But it focused, because very often what they emphasize is that women are very emphatic, they can relate to, children and other, people, etc., etc. But this was the only one that actually focused on the effectiveness of women peacekeepers and not on their social empathies, which I thought was a tremendous turning point, except of course it was rolled back already by Russia and China in the latest discussions. But on the other hand, that was really something that I found extremely important to keep track of. What I also find important is that you mentioned the discrimination that women are subject to. I think that was a very good point that you raised. And I think that one needs to focus on that. And when it comes to the financing, again, coming back to, because you talked about political office, that's where financing and funding of women to run for office is extremely important as far as I'm concerned. And I think we need to keep that in mind, that, once you finish your studies and you even want to run for office, or you want to support other women running for office, it's a good way to send a little money that way if you can afford it, and basically support that, because it really is, or with voluntary work to support campaigns, that really is where as I say, the rubber hits the road. One of the aspects that none of you have mentioned, which I also think is very important, is education. I think to basically, educate, not every woman has the opportunity to be educated, but whatever opportunities, maybe they should be created, or maybe they should be advanced. And I think that is really important to mention. And the last item I wanted to mention before we go on to the next issue is I was always very much against quotas, because you don't want to be a quota woman. But I will tell you that I've changed my mind, and I'm now a fervent supporter of quotas. And I think they have worked. If you look at the Nordic countries, they have had quotas for a long time. And where do you have most women leaders? In the Nordic countries: Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark. Very strong. Iceland, very strong participation of women in politics, in the social life, ministers, etc. Very high ranking. It's worked. And so I have changed my mind. Anyway, going on to the next issue, I have another round. And that basically I wanted to ask you is, what are you most excited about the Generation Equality Forum? And the other aspect that I think we'd also like to hear, because clearly this is the first time that we're having it, but there will most likely be follow-on, is like, what's missing? Is there something that we could add, that we should add? And what would you like to give the advice to other young people who are in your area, in your region, in the world, that they should engage, or how they should engage, or what they should do? So let me turn this over. Maybe I can do a reverse round. Maybe Linda, I will start with you.
Yes, I'll say that I'm very much excited for this Generation Equality Forum, because we have now Intergenerational Gender Agenda platform in the global avenue, and it's reaching out to young people in different contexts, different spaces, and it's very important that we have these dialogues, so that we know who is doing what and how can we improve. I can also say that maybe we should in future we should have more inclusion of non-binary groups. We need to hear their voices, women with disabilities, women from rural communities, and even migrant women. We need to have them on board and also hear their stories. And then I can say, Angela, as much as we are saying issues of women, or we are asking where are the women, I think it's also time to be context specific, and also ask about which women are we looking for, or which women are we talking about? Because women are not a homogeneous entity. We have different agency, they have the different contexts, and they face inequalities differently. And also at the same time, maybe we should have men on board, because it's important that we move together. we need to men also to be advocates for gender equality. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Linda. I think that that's very true. There are a number of gender support groups that I'm aware of, and men are always encouraged to be present in there, and they actually have joined. So let's hope. Let's hope. I'm always an optimist. Jennifer.
Ok, creo que a mí lo que más me entusiasma del Foro para la Igualdad Generacional es que este es un espacio de mujeres donde podemos compartir todas esas experiencias y así ver como redes de apoyo y generar redes de apoyo que permitan incidir y sensibilizar a la población. Es cierto que tenemos una pandemia por COVID, pero esta es una de las muchas cosas que podemos hacer, estemos donde estemos. Realmente la virtualidad es un recurso que ha facilitado llegar a lugares en donde antes no podíamos ni imaginarnos. Y realmente este espacio creo que es una oportunidad para que nosotras vayamos apoyando más mujeres, vayamos incidiendo desde nuestros pequeños espacios o grandes espacios de cómo podemos ayudar, de cómo podemos fomentar la igualdad de género, de qué es lo que realmente buscamos con esa implementación. Y realmente, pese a que podemos crear campañas, podemos crear muchas actividades que realmente sumen a todos esos esfuerzos. Realmente considero que en este foro podría incluirse a todas aquellas mujeres que tienen experiencias mucho más crueles, que tienen experiencias mucho más duras, porque sus realidades o sus culturas así son. Lastimosamente hay mucho por qué trabajar, hay muchas cosas de donde podemos aportar, y es que solamente entendiendo y viendo las cosas que no son de mi experiencia, pero viendo cómo otras mujeres han luchado a través de las historias, desde diferentes culturas y de diferentes lugares del mundo, es que uno puede venir y decir, yo quiero estar en estas cosas, quiero incidir desde mi espacio, quiero incidir en la capacitación o información o conocimiento a todas las personas que nos están viendo o que todavía no saben del tema. Y es que realmente el feminismo abarca muchos temas y nos quedamos cortos porque hay cosas que realmente, por el mismo hecho de que no hemos creado sinergias con otras personas y hemos quedado como en nuestro espacio, no conocemos, y es una oportunidad simplemente para ayudar y aportar más.
Thank you very much. I think that's again, it's a very crucial point. It's not only we know each other, we can network together. And I'm reminded when you had all of these intergovernmental conferences where all the member states participated, the conferences on women, what was the most vibrant part of these conferences? That was the NGO, academia, civil society that was holding meetings next to those. And very often the delegates sort of said those are much more interesting than the statements that were delivered by member states. And that's a wonderful opportunity to network, but also to hear diverse voices. And what you mentioned is, I think, important because, we are certainly in a, let's say, a more privileged group here. And I think to also hear others who have grown up in a less privileged environment or with a less privileged access maybe to education. And I'm always reminded of when you hear, you have a forum on Indigenous women, you hear, for example, Rigoberta Menchú, she really shook up everyone, with her story. And it's very graphic when you hear that, and you basically, it's something that you don't forget. So sometimes we also need to listen to a much wider variety of voices than sometimes we hear. But on the other hand, what is important is not only to hear those voices, but also to have a way forward as to what are we actually going to do about it, and that comes in the law, the basis that is being developed on the governmental level. Now we have Jennifer. We have Jennifer Grossman, please.
Yes, I'm very excited by Generation Equality Forum's virtual environment and aspect this year. We are seeing more voices brought into these conversations from around the world, voices that are not generally heard, like you just mentioned. And I hope that, that global networking, that learning, that sharing of best practice continues throughout the year. And I think it will, especially since we do have these action coalitions that galvanize commitments and measurable commitments. And I also would like to see more private sector involvement. We do have some businesses involved this year, but we won't be making progress on advancing gender equality, particularly in the economic justice, the tech and innovation, and the climate realms, without having businesses all involved and providing those solutions and really, learning from each other how the business world does have a responsibility to advance gender equality and sustainable development. And thinking to my advice, for everyone on this call today, for those interested in gender equality, how important it is to run for elected office, and especially at the local level. Previous to my time at Georgetown, I did work with U.S. state legislators, so not at the federal level, but at that state level, at your local level, your towns, your communities, you really have a lot of decisions being made on education, health, jobs, childcare, that these decision makers don't receive the attention that you do maybe at the global or the national level. So I encourage everyone to consider running for office or becoming more involved there, and also becoming informed on issues that are not explicitly feminist, such as taxation or trade, and bring that feminist perspective in, because that's really needed. We know that feminism is needed in all spheres. We know that every policy issue has a gender component. So really becoming well-versed in those issues and then going into these political spheres that don't generally consider gender or feminism really will lead to, I think, a lot of advances down the line. And I think I'm just very excited to hear from everyone involved this week at the forum and just learn from each other.
Thank you, Ashley. Very true. And I would underline also the effect of private business or companies getting involved. It's very important because if you think about some of the companies that now dominate world trade, or let's say world that have a huge product, is basically like from Alibaba to Apple to Facebook, etc. I mean, they're much larger than governments very often because they have a much larger output, and they influence basically a lot that is happening around the world and not only in one particular country. So that's really something where one has to also see if there's any leverage at all that can be applied, and that would be really very good. And running for office, I think that your point is well taken in terms of the not only gender issues but also taxation issues and others that affect women, legal issues as well. I mean, I must tell you that if you think about my mother never worked because she was not allowed to. Her husband had to give her permission if she wanted to work, and he refused to do so because it would mean that he could not be seen as the wage earner of the family. So, that's basically a law that was changed some time ago, but not even that long ago. It was only in the 60s. So, that's something that one has to look at. And that goes back to the legal issues that were mentioned already before by some of you. Very important points. Ashley, it's over to you.
So I think what I'm most excited about is just being a part of this dialogue. But more than that, I am really excited by the concept of intergenerational dialogues. I think that it's really easy these days to fall into this line of thinking that, we're boomers and zoomers and millennials and Gen X. We haven't forgotten about you, I promise. But, we're all human and we all have something to learn from each other. And I really like the emphasis on intergenerational dialogue. And I also wanted to second Linda's point about stressing the inclusion of non-binary identities, trans identities. I think, in my own research of assault in the military, I noticed that there was a lot of information on the issue in terms of like men versus women, but as far as how that rate is affected in terms of like race, just a more intersectional approach, gender identity, sexual orientation. It's just the research on that is non-existent. And so I think advice moving forward is always ask, what don't we know? And that's such a hard question to answer, but it's one that like I really think we should stress. And finally, in terms of advice for future leaders or anybody who is interested in this topic, is just take care of yourself first and foremost. Progress is so emotionally taxing, particularly on those who have the most to gain from it. And so I would just say, don't guilt trip yourself for needing a day off or however much time you need to recuperate from your work. I think we should really normalize self-care. So thank you.
That's great advice. I'm not sure everyone takes that to heart, but we probably all should. So thank you.
Easier said than done, for sure.
Now, I want to underline one point that's to me really meaningful, and that is that without the pandemic and with these constant Zoom meetings, we wouldn't have as intense an intergenerational dialogue as we're having now. And I think that looking back, as painful as it has been to adapt to this, it's actually one of the main benefits of being able to do this. I mean, how many meetings took place when we started off in Mexico? How many meetings are we having now? How many meetings do we all participate in? And yes, it's not the same thing as getting the energy in the room. But on the other hand, it is a way to substitute and actually to make linkages that would be very difficult to do if we're in different continents and have to spend a lot of money and time traveling, etc. So to my mind, that's something that is really, really meaningful in terms of coming out of this pandemic. And let me say something else, and that is because I'm looking at you, Ashley, because you said you're interested in writing. Write something for others. Leave something behind. Don't only talk. Leave something behind. And again, whether the intergenerational dialogue can be captured in terms of a blog or something. I don't know exactly how this will develop, but I think to me, this is something that is actually very meaningful, that one can share experiences, across timelines, across continents, across background, whatever it is. That to my mind is really, really important. So I would encourage you to do that. And if there's also a possibility to publish it in the media or even social media, again, I think that is something that I would like to see and I would like to encourage. So, with that, I know we have a very short video at the end. That's what Julie has told me. I wanted to particularly thank you for being available and for speaking so candidly and making such good observation and assessments. And I'm trusting they will be captured by the GWL and by the Generation Equality Forum. And I'm very happy to have met you. And maybe our paths will cross again somewhere, electronically or real. So let's see what happens. I wish you all the very, very best. Bye-bye.
There is a new CEO in the company. How did she get here? What did she do to get this far? I'm sure she only got the job because she's pretty. This CEO that is the object of these types of comments on a daily basis is part of a selected group of female CEOs. And I say selected because only 27% of women hold powerful positions. It's clear that something has to change, right? But how do we do this if the ones who create the laws are mostly men? And how do we do this if only 20 countries in the world are governed by women? And how do we do this if female representation in parliaments is still far from the third considered necessary to create laws in gender equality? How do we expect to get equality if these critical and judgmental views are the ones deciding on women's paths? About 100 years ago, the suffragettes had a motto: deeds, not words. 100 years ago, they considered it was time to stop talking and start taking action.
Okay, so you've seen there was not only mansplaining, but also womansplaining in addition to some other things. So that concludes our meeting. And I think I will sign off together with you as well. Thank you very much. And we'll tune in for the Paris sessions. And so hope to see you soon. Bye-bye then. Bye-bye.